Previewing week 8 of college football right here at the Voice of College Football. Time to check in with Bill Bender of the Sporting News. We appreciate Bill stopping by and always enjoy the conversation. Bill, how you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, we saw one of these games of the century in Autzen Stadium last weekend, and we will see another one this Saturday, of course, in Austin, Texas. But specifically with Ohio State, when a team loses a major game like this is the way I frame it from a big picture standpoint. Obviously, they have issues to clean up, secondary and otherwise. No doubt. This is a flawed football team to an extent. But how many people picked any team to go undefeated? You know, people within the media, people that should know what they're talking about and analyzing, typically pick the best teams to go 11-1. Just the odds say you're going to trip up at some point. 11-1. What was the game that was most likely a loss for Ohio State? I know, at least in my camp, I produced a video, gave percentage totals and probabilities, and Oregon was right at the top. So if you would have told somebody back in any time during the offseason, Ohio State's going to go 11-1, or they're going to have one loss, they're going to lose to Oregon 32-31, they're going to be in field goal range to win the game, the thought would be, okay, no big deal. But maybe the emotion of the immediacy is I'm hearing, this is a flawed team. They're overrated. They're not as good as we thought they were, and all of that. How would you review Ohio State's performance?
Well, you said it. I mean, these are the math has changed on when you lose a game like this now, because you can look at it like we have an out. We lost a game, but it's 12-team playoff. We can probably afford a mulligan. That's what I always call it, a mulligan, like you have in golf. And there are some real concerns. The secondary you mentioned, giving up 8 plays of 20 yards or more, allowing Dylan Gabriel to be comfortable during the game. But big picture, I'm starting to believe that I don't know that there'll be an undefeated team in the Power Four. I would confine that, at least. I don't know that there'll be an unbeaten Big Ten or SEC team. Though Oregon, if you look at their schedule, they've got a pretty clean look to Indianapolis, where they should be favored in every game moving forward. I guess the Michigan game could be a trap game for them in some ways with the cross-country flight. That's the other thing I wanted to talk to you about too, is this cross-country impact on the Big Ten is very real. When, you have the 2 time zone rule and only the home team has only lost 3 games, that's a big deal.
It's a big deal, and I believe the loss total stands at around 10. I know I was tracking it before last weekend. Of course, we had the Penn State win and the Minnesota wins, but if you look at those versus the evaluations of those teams, for Penn State to be pushed to overtime by USC on the road maybe speaks to that factor even as much as a loss would. And with Minnesota, I think at this point in the season, it's been proven that they're a decent team and decidedly better than UCLA, and they're pushed to the last 20 seconds of the game at the Rose Bowl. Those almost confirm that narrative even more.
I agree. And, for Penn, as much as Ohio State and Oregon is the topic of conversation, I think there's 2 ways to look at that game. The one would be Ohio State had a chance to win in the final minute, mismanaged the game ending drive in some ways. And also there were some questionable calls by the refs, the play callers. There's just a lot of questions after the final couple minutes of that game, especially with the 12-man rule, an offensive pass interference call. That it was offensive pass interference, in my opinion. I just don't know how often they call that in that situation. With Jeremiah Smith trying to get separation and Will Howard sliding. I saw people I was making a Zapruder comparison that, was there 1 second left? Was there not? Did they get the timeout? Who cares? They lost the game. Took away from what Penn State did. Penn State was impressive on the road to come back from 20-6 with all those cross-country things we talked about. Tyler Warren was unguardable. And I think that was just a loud statement to me that James Franklin won a big game on the road and kind of buried USC in the Big Ten race.
Yes. People are out for Lincoln Riley at this point, and I get it. When you shake it all out, it's just all about wins and losses. However, this team is right there against good opponents. So of course, the standard at USC is to win the games, not just look good or be close. But it's a third year for Lincoln Riley. I don't think he's anywhere close to a hot seat. I don't think USC approaches things like that. There's a money factor, of course. And where do you go that's better than Lincoln Riley? But I see, and people need to separate, of course, what's talked about on social media versus what the actual decision makers are doing and saying.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and they've lost close games and they're going to have to adjust. You see this in conferences all the time. Look at the record of, I got to get these teams right: BYU, Houston, I might need help, UCF, and Cincinnati. If you look at how much they struggled in the Big 12 last year, it's that first year in a new conference. You're going to unfamiliar settings. And then this year, Cincinnati's better. UCF's been up and down. Houston has a coaching change, so they're getting through that. And BYU's undefeated. So I do think there is that year of getting used to it. Maybe that's a bad example in the SEC, but Texas is different, in my opinion, because they're just really good. They have enough talent that they're really good. But, you know, when we talk next week, what are we going to talk about if Georgia beats Texas? Not ready for the SEC, not ready for the trenches, those kind of things. But I think for USC, there is a very real issue up front on both sides that, you know, in these games, Michigan was pushing them around. Wisconsin pushed them around for a half. They actually did better on the run against Penn State. They just couldn't stop Tyler Warren. That was one of the most remarkable performances of the season by the Penn State tight end.
It really is. And it makes me think of Brock Bowers, because I always thought, how could you run an offense through a tight end? How could the tight end, for as important as they are as a security blanket for the quarterback, doesn't seem very productive or explosive for a tight end to be your main weapon on offense. But of course, Georgia disproved that with Brock Bowers, who I thought was a generational talent. And I'm not comparing the two athletically or from an NFL perspective standpoint, because I don't know what the thought is about Tyler Warren, but the performance that he turned in from a statistics standpoint was, of course, way past anything Brock Bowers put on a stat sheet. But yeah, Penn State's best player on offense is turning into a tight end. And people that have followed the Big Ten have known about him for quite some time.
For sure. And mismatch, I made a comparison all week to Mark Bavaro. That's a dated reference, I understand, but the old Notre Dame tight end that played for the Giants, he kind of, that's what I'm seeing. This guy that just can shield defenders, make the big catch, gets down the field. Everybody gets compared to Gronkowski and Kelsey these days. I actually think the Texas tight end, Gunnar Helm, is a little bit like Kelsey. So it's cool to see good tight ends in the game. And again, big picture, Penn State now with an opportunity on November 2nd to play Ohio State at home. They haven't beat the Buckeyes since 2016. That's well documented. And then you look at a situation where if Penn State wins that game, it's probably going to be Penn State and Oregon in the Big Ten championship. And then Ohio State's sitting there in the third seed with a high pressure game against Indiana, who has a huge game this weekend against Nebraska. I mean, of all the Big Ten games this weekend, that's the one that you have to watch, because the winner of that game is probably sitting in that fourth spot if the Big Ten is trying to get 4 playoff bids.
Bill Bender joining us from Sporting News. Bill has a number of pieces coming out this week, preseason All-America team from you, and also a selection involving Red Grange. If folks, if you're unaware, it's the 100th anniversary of, you know, I've seen this several times, but I didn't know what exactly it was. Was it his Galloping Ghost famed game against Michigan? Is that the 100-year anniversary or just the beginning of his career?
Yeah, it's the 100th anniversary of the Michigan game, which was, I've read a book by Doug Villard about Red Grange, the golden age of red. And it's so fascinating. Like if you look, and if you're a college football nerd like I am, you look back 100 years at this Michigan game, and I think the most fascinating thing about the game itself was this. Fielding Yost at the time, Michigan's a dominant program. Coaches at the time had the option of, so they kicked the ball off to start the game. Red Grange runs it back. The coaches at the time had the option of either receiving or kicking after the opposing team scored a touchdown. So basically, Michigan could say, we'll take the ball, or they kicked off again, because at the time it was a field position game. There wasn't a lot of touchdowns. Well, Red Grange scored 4 touchdowns in 12 minutes. And the comparison Doug gave me would be like a baseball player hitting 4 straight grand slams. Like that's what the comparison to the time was. And just his celebrity and what he meant to college football, getting the NFL started. There's a lot there that maybe gets lost a couple generations, because even when I was growing up, it was, oh, Red Grange. Yeah, that guy was a stud, but you didn't really know, you just kind of look at it as leather helmet football. It's a really fascinating story. It was fun to dig into. And, Illinois obviously takes that seriously. I had that circled in July that's a tricky spot for Michigan anyway, before their quarterback struggles and everything they're going through. So I think they're stepping into one there.
Yeah, I guess we'll dive a little bit deeper into this matchup. Illinois, whether they were quote unquote looking ahead or whatever the situation, they ran into a freshman quarterback in Ryan Brown at Purdue, who suddenly has, I have yet to see him play. I think people can forgive me for Purdue, somewhat descending on my list of priorities every Saturday, that I have yet to see that. But I did check in very late in that game because I wanted to see this monumental upset and comeback by Purdue if they were able to pull it off. So I saw the last couple plays and some of overtime, but they've got this quarterback who's now throwing for 300 yards and rushing for 100 against Illinois. I had a little bit more faith in Brett Bielema's defense prior to Saturday. It may be a one-off. It may be just a bad matchup that they got into one of those kind of games, but they were able to survive and now take on Michigan. And these are two fairly, although the Luke Altmaier factor means that Illinois has a distinct advantage in the passing game, you would think. And Michigan is still trying to figure out who's going to play quarterback. I don't know. I did not see Sharon Moore's news conference this week, whether he announced a starter.
No, and I didn't even look at that either. So I'm going to cheat and try to see now if there's anything. But it might be, I don't know. Yeah, it's very cloudy. So I think you could see Orgy, you could see Tuttle. They've tried everything. They just don't have an answer at quarterback this year. And whether that means that Jaden Davis gets the keys at some point, a freshman, we'll see. They will face a challenge with Luke Altmaier. He's only thrown 1 interception. He's been really good, efficient in Illinois' offense. They are at home, and this would be a no-brainer Illinois pick for me, if not for the second half of that Purdue game where they give up 40 points and a half. And Michigan's going to want to run the football, and Donovan Edwards and Khalil Mullins. Khalil Mullins is one of the best running backs in the country. So it's just going to be a tight game. I think it's going to be a tight, fun, exciting game, and probably a field goal either way. And Michigan games have been really tough for me to pick this year, because I think I picked them to lose against USC. They won. I picked them to win against Washington. They lost. Everything in between, I can't figure them out. So I would anticipate whatever I picked Michigan to win by a field goal. So you might want to go the other way.
I'm now reviewing my Michigan picks. I did pick them to lose to Texas. I did pick them to beat USC, but I also picked them to beat Washington. So I've stumbled a couple of times, or at least once, on my Michigan picks. We got Bill Bender here.
Oh, real quick, Jack Tuttle is starting.
Okay.
So and they're calling him Uncle Jack Tuttle. So I that's probably the right move. He seems to be the most functional in the passing game. Then you can mix in Orgy on some runs. I mean, if I was Michigan, I might put Orgy at slot receiver, because they have a serious problem at receiver.
They did that in inverse, about 12 years ago with Devin Gardner,
right?
Where I was pretty remarkable. I thought it was pretty remarkable at the time that I'm watching this Michigan receiver transition to a quarterback right in the middle of the season, and he was pretty good. I was like, wow, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, Gardner, and then they did the same with Denard Robinson when they probably moved him to running back late. He probably should have just been playing running back or slot receiver early, and one of their most dynamic talents in program history. So yeah, it adds up to what should be a pretty exciting game between those two, and it follows the Indiana game where Big Noon's there, I believe, and the Hoosiers have a chance to sprint out to 7-0 with that offense around Curt Cignetti, which brings me to another point, Mark. it's going to be interesting to see how the Hoosiers balance being in the playoff mix versus every Power 5 opening wanting, or Power 4 opening wanting Kirk Cignetti, right? Like Florida would be a place that you would watch as we get down the stretch. And is he going to leave? And I've been curious about that from the jump, is how do these programs that are in a playoff race handle their coaches? You know, Lane Kiffin's another example. He comes up every year. Well, Ole Miss has 2 losses now. You know, do these coaches leave in the middle of the season? It's not out of, I don't think it can happen, but it's not out of the question.
Yeah, we've seen all sorts of things in college football over the last 3 years that we would have not predicted. So I'm right there with you. And of course, with a 14 playoff, I'm trying to think, there was 1 or 2 incidents similar to that. But of course, you've got the limited field, so it's unlikely to happen, much less so than it is now. So yeah, that's an interesting factor. And you brought up Indiana-Nebraska as possibly the game of the week in the Big Ten. This is, to me, one of those testing ground games. Okay, we know Nebraska's improved. We know Indiana's substantially improved, but now they're going to face someone at their own level, or their new level. For Indiana, this is their new level. They've now been able to pass Michigan State and Maryland, a couple teams that are typically in front of them, with wins. And so now, where do they stand against Nebraska? Nebraska defense versus Indiana offense. I was checking out Curtis Rourke's numbers.
They're good, right?
No, they're really good. 74%, and 14-2, I think, is the TD to pick ratio versus Dylan Raiola. Great talent. I'm sure that he's going to have a tremendous career at Nebraska. I believe so. But to date, he's faced an Illinois team that was his first testing ground, didn't play well in the fourth quarter or overtime, and then struggled against Rutgers on a 13-for-27. So we know Nebraska's defense is good, but Indiana is going to score points. So they're going to need something, you would think, out of Raiola to keep up with that Indiana offense.
Yeah, and I'm curious to see another 1-score game. Nebraska won one of those a couple of weeks ago, and it is a contrast in styles. Nebraska, how good is your defense? And Indiana was impressed with how they beat Northwestern. They pulled away in the second half, and this is the best defense they've seen to this point. You know, Nebraska's pretty good on defense. So it seems like each game that Indiana can win, we're going to believe a little more. At least I feel that way. Watching them beat Northwestern, I know that might not do it for some people, but Northwestern pretty decent on defense most of the time. And Nebraska is a little bit better. It's a huge spot in Bloomington. Indiana's also got a running game. You know, they got 2 running backs behind. Ellison's great behind Rourke. So this offense is real. And it feels a little bit like James Madison in crimson uniforms last year. James Madison was that team before they lost. And they took that all the way into November. So they absolutely are a factor in this race. And Nebraska can, man, what a 2-week stretch for them. They beat Indiana. They go into the shoe, get a chance to prove it against Ohio State. So we're going to learn all we need to learn about Dylan Raiola, that Nebraska defense, and whether or not Matt Rule. I do think he has them. Like, they're 5-1, so they're 1 game away from bowl eligibility, which is a step for them, considering they haven't been in a bowl game since 2016.
Bill Bender joining us from Sporting News, breaking down Week 8 across the Big Ten in college football. So Georgia, Texas, of course, gains everybody's attention in prime time. Georgia would have been a favorite during the offseason. I know from our friends in Vegas that it's moved from, like, Georgia being a slight favorite in the offseason to the last few weeks of play, turning it to Texas by about 3 points. Texas looks like they've got their house in order. Georgia looks a little wobbly by their standards, of course, barely beating, although they had game control against Mississippi State, not dominating the game, and the Kentucky game, the Alabama game, of course. So, with the upsets we've seen, Bill, in the SEC, double-digit upsets, Vandy, Bama, Ole Miss, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas. There's another one out there that I'm forgetting in the moment. The general consensus was Georgia, Texas, Alabama, Ole Miss will just beat each other. Those are the only losses they're going to have. So they're all going to be 11-1, 10-2, and they're going to be playoff teams. Well, once you start knocking off losses coming from outside that 4-team deal or whomever you placed there, maybe Tennessee, then you get more likelihood that there are some teams at the top that are going to be in trouble.
For sure. And this game is another example of the narrative that I was joking about this and may have already done this on this show. I think no conference publicizes their losses better than the SEC. That goes back to 2 weeks ago with Tennessee, and then suddenly Arkansas is the toughest place in America to play, and Alabama, you can't. There's no spin there. That's a bad loss. I know Vandy's improved. I understand that, and here we go with Georgia. An interesting narrative here. You're seeing pieces written. We've got one coming too about Kirby and the week that he's had between shoving a player, which he did, and a bad explanation afterward. Mark, I couldn't, if I shoved one of my basketball players in 8th grade and the parent came up to me and said, well, I just didn't know I did it. Well, you still did it. So it was a poor explanation at best. And the heat on Georgia with potentially having 2 losses here. They're not as good as they normally are. They're still really good. Let's not act like Georgia's terrible. They're not running the ball as well as they normally do. They rank 13th in the SEC in rushing yards. They're 10th in run defense. It's not that typical run the ball, stop the run grinder that Kirby Smart has. I think they're going to have some problems at Texas. And I say that and watch him pull the underdog card. They win, and then all of a sudden Georgia's great and Texas is great, and these are the 2 best teams in the country, which they'll try to sell, and they'll spin, and they do it well. They do spin losses way better than the Big Ten does. They always have. And I don't know what the reason for that is. I think in the Big Ten, and you notice this, right, that Ohio State loses and suddenly Will Howard's terrible, Ohio State's terrible, Ryan Day can't win the big game. It's an absurd narrative that spawns every time Ohio State loses, whereas Alabama's looked bad for 2 weeks.
Absolutely. And it's a rankings game as well. If you can start the preseason with enough ranked teams, and then, you're constantly losing to ranked teams within the SEC, then that helps the narrative as well. That just confirms the narrative. I try to strip the rankings away and just evaluate the teams, because then you can always get into that game. Well, they lost to number 7. That wasn't a bad loss. That's a good loss. And then, and it's a self-perpetuating kind of prophecy or narrative within itself. Is there a game across America that intrigues you that may not be gaining a lot of attention?
No, we talked at length a little bit about the 2 Big Ten games. I'll have my eyes on those. A team, they're not playing this week, but they come in. I kind of peek you ahead into next Thursday would be Pitt. They are 6-0. They keep winning these 1-score games. They're one of those teams that can, I think, make some noise because Pat does this every once in a while, and they're able to just keep winning these close games. Desmond Reed is one of the nation's best kept secrets, and I think as long as they can continue to win, they'll be in the picture. My editor, Bill, will be at Notre Dame, Georgia Tech. So that line's been tripping me up all week. 8.5 points. I think Georgia Tech's pretty good. They're playing. People are going to say, well, why are they playing in Mercedes-Benz Stadium? Well, it's a big stadium. They can fit everybody in there and make a lot more money. And then they have these games against the service academies coming up. And both service academies are really good. 100th anniversary also of the Army Notre Dame game. So again, for us history nerds, that's pretty cool that Army's undefeated. Notre Dame's got 1 loss. That'll be a huge game as well. So want to see if Georgia Tech, who I think is pretty good, can hang around with Notre Dame for 4 quarters and make that one interesting.
Bill, now that we've played half a season, and even though it's not the half that's as important as the second half, not just because of recency and timing, but because there are obviously more fluff games in the first half than the second half. So I'm not going to play it as important or weighty as the second half. So we've got a lot more football to play. How many teams do you think can win the national championship?
Oh man, well, 5 to 6 right now. I think Oregon, Ohio State. I would say Penn State, maybe. Can I have them as a maybe? Like they're right there. Georgia, Texas, Alabama, LSU. So there's 7. LSU's a maybe. So I would say 5 with LSU, Penn State, maybe. Don't think a Big 12 team can win 3 games. And Clemson. The way Clemson's playing, I would throw them in there. I think they are proof that a week 1 loss you can learn from. And Garrett, Riley, and Dabo have kind of settled into a rhythm. They're not going to back down if they play in Alabama. Now, granted, they've done all this against just average teams, but I think I would put them in the mix. So that's 5 teams that I think can actually do it with 3 maybes in LSU, Penn State, and Clemson. So why didn't we just do an 8-team playoff? That would have been easier.
I think you're being kind with the average take on the Clemson schedule to date, but I get you.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like they are playing well, but they haven't played anybody since Georgia. So, and they don't play Miami on the schedule. They're kind of going to be able to go burn through the ACC. I mentioned Pitt earlier. I don't know if Pitt can beat Clemson. I don't know if Miami and Pitt play at least. Then that'll be an interesting one. I like Miami. I just don't know that they're capable of winning, like going through potentially Georgia 1 week and then Ohio State. I just can't see it.
Yeah, I'm with you. I would say that maybe Miami and Tennessee would be the first ones off your board that I would give some level of shot to.
Tennessee can play defense, to your point there. They can, but they need to start trusting, and that starts this week. They need to trust Nico Iamaleava to throw the ball down the field. And it's Alabama. I put Alabama on the list, but the way they're playing right now, the answer would probably be no. Their defense is dysfunctional. We were talking about this in an editorial meeting yesterday. I said, well, they're criticizing Kalen DeBoer's wardrobe down in Tuscaloosa now. And whenever they're doing that, that just shows that they'll find something to be unhappy about. And they're not happy with how they're playing the last 2 weeks.
Got to hit you with one more, Bill, that comes to mind that is right up your alley. I am telling people that I guarantee that 1 out of these 4 conferences at least is going to have some crazy tiebreaker that is going to leave us thinking, well, we know what the tiebreaker is and that it fell this way, but this team that got left out, aren't they just as good, or they might be better than this team? Because we've got these teams running in these silos. And of course, the larger you expand the conference, the more possible opponents that you miss within your conference, which is usually about 8 now with these large conferences, about 8 teams that you don't play. So you got all sorts of teams in these conferences that don't play each other. Therefore, we are not going to have head-to-head, and we are running toward 3 and 4 team ties for whether it's first place, second place, or just a log jam between the two.
You're predicting the future here because it's coming and it's going to be brutal figuring some of these out. LSU is a great example. Each week I go through and look through the Power 4 standings, and I started looking at the SEC and I was like, oh yeah, LSU hasn't lost in conference yet. And oh yeah, LSU has all their tough games at home, and they play Texas A&M, who, by the way, also hasn't lost in their conference yet. And when we get to this stage where I'm curious to see what it means for the conference championship, but I don't care as much about that. I know the schools do, because somebody needs to get in these games. Somebody needs to get a bye week. I've contended all along that in this new setup, the conference championships, aside from being a money grab and TV, they don't mean as much, because both of those teams are going to be in the playoff anyway. They mean a lot for the Big 12 and the ACC. I don't think they mean as much for the SEC and the Big 10. And the other part of that conversation, which is so, I think you get this, is we got rid of divisions and now it's more confusing. So, if we had 2 divisions of 9 in the Big 10 and they played 8 teams, but then you wouldn't get the crossover and these matchups that they want. So, yeah, there's going to be some tiebreaker messes. I think I would predict that the Big 10 has one and the SEC has one. The Big 12 might sort itself out. I think they may end up being okay, but you may have 3 one-loss teams. Remember last year in the ACC, there was a point in the season where Louisville, Florida State, and North Carolina, none of them had a loss, and none of them were playing each other during the regular season. So how do you rectify that? I have no idea. So when we get into November and I'm on this show, you and I are going to have to sort out the Big 10, I think, especially with that Ohio State loss being in there.
Yeah, that'll be especially egregious if there are 3 teams that tie with no losses, and then you're leaving out a no-loss team
Right.
out of a conference championship game. And again, I'm right there with you. I couldn't have stated it any better, and you're right on my talking points and what they've been this season. Yeah, the ACC and the Big 12, the championship games are going to be huge. Big 10, unless we've got, let's say, Miami goes undefeated during the regular season and they show up in the ACC championship game, and they should be safe. They should be okay. They lose by a field goal to Clemson. Okay, they're still fine. But the Big 12, my goodness, that's going to be enormous. And I'm rooting for the Pitts and the BYUs of the world. I want to see a little guy in there that we never considered making a playoff. So I'm intrigued by those teams as you are.
Right now, I have BYU going to Ohio State in a first-round matchup, and I was trying to rewind in my head if I've ever seen BYU play Ohio State. I think the answer is no, but I'd have to go back and look. You would probably know.
We got 3 bowl games to go to. We've got the 82 Holiday Bowl.
There you go.
Ohio State 47-17. We got the 85 Citrus that Ohio State won on a late interception by, I believe, Larry Kolick, 10-7. Then we have I know there's a third game. Maybe those are the only 2.
I don't think they caught Ty Detmer, did they? That was what I was trying to figure out.
No,
No,
because his Heisman season was 90. They played in the 93 Holiday Bowl. Raymond Harris had a
there you go.
Huge game.
I feel like I get the BYU matchups confused with, I know they played Air Force when I was in 6th grade, for example. So, and
I got a couple years on you.
And the one there was Jim Grobe was the Air Force defensive coordinator who I'm dear friends with. I got to know him when he was the coach at Ohio University. So I've heard some stories from that bowl game.
Yeah, that's when bowl games meant everything, even if you got descended down to the Liberty, which was such a strange season for Ohio State because they came within like 1 foot of going to the Rose Bowl and winning the Big Ten title outright. But since John Cooper went for it on 4th and short with a option play by Greg Fry of all people, they gave up the ball at their own 30. Michigan kicked the game-winning field goal. That put the Big Ten into this crazy 4-way tie. And Iowa went to the Rose Bowl. Ohio State was back at 5. What was their record? 5-2-1 in the Big Ten, and everybody else was 6-2. So they dropped all the way to the Liberty Bowl. It was like 35 degrees and rainy, and they're a 17-point favorite, and they go in there with Robert Smith and a slew of NFL players, and Air Force takes him to task.
Yep, and I've heard a couple things from that game that Jim knew, and it was fun. It was fun to review that game with him. He was always very complimentary of the Ohio State talent, and so yeah, I mean that like you said, that was when those tiebreakers mattered more, and they're going to matter again, and it's coming. So we've got a fun second half of season to figure some of this stuff out.
Sorry to start ranting on the
past.
Oh,
you're good.
Nobody wants to hear that.
It's fine.
Bill Bender, Sporting News. Great stuff from Bill. Bill, we always appreciate you stopping by. It's always a great conversation.
Hey, thank you.